Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, as parliamentarians prepare to get back to work, of course, Parliament resumes next week, but is going to be gravitating once again to Ottawa. The political parties are getting set for that. And as we speak, we do this podcast today, Prime Minister Carney and the Liberal caucus are out in Edmonton, Carney's hometown, I guess, trying to plot strategy for the upcoming session. And it's interesting to see some of the media coverage that's going on here. And I want to talk a little bit about that. There's more than a couple of articles that have been written in some of the publications here. One in front of me right now is from the Hill Times. That's the publication that basically covers what's going on in Parliament Hill. And they're talking about, the Liberals are meeting, but there's a lot of disgruntled Liberals. There's dissension in the ranks with the Liberal caucus. They're upset with Carney, and they're upset with this and with that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to tell you, as somebody who spent an awful lot of time in the media, the easiest thing to do is to find a couple of disgruntled people and write about that and say, see, things are falling apart here. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, and we'll explain that. First of all, when you look at a lot of the public opinion polls, Prime Minister Carney is still enjoying a huge amount of support from Canadians. The overwhelming majority of support is still there. And it's gone down a little bit since the election, but that's to be expected, right? No matter what, simply because people get on with their lives and that, there's some concern maybe things aren't happening fast enough. And that's, in some cases, a very legitimate criticism. One of the other elements to this whole thing that I've noticed, if you start reading beyond the headline here, is that, who are the disgruntled people, supposedly, in the Liberal caucus? Well, we're told from some sources that two of them are John Wilkinson and Bill Blair. They were both ministers, of course, in the Trudeau government, and both were passed over by Mark Carney when he decided who was going to be and who was not going to be in his cabinet. So is this just, people that are ticked off that they didn't get the call and they're simply going to grumble about that? Could be. I mean, Wilkinson in particular was pretty vocal about the fact that he got left out of cabinet when Carney formed his government. So you got to understand where that's coming from. Now, as for anybody else who might be a little bit upset, there are always going to be winners and losers. When parliamentary secretaries are picked, when cabinet ministers are picked, and things of this nature. So, it's not all one big happy family. No political party is. And nobody's going to start joining hands and singing Kumbaya. Behind closed doors, there's going to be some discontent and some people that may have some issues. And that's the way it should be. And, how they deal with that and how the Prime Minister and the Cabinet deal with that is really, I think, an indicator as to just, how extensive this is. But Canadians, by and large, are still supportive of Carney and the government. They're not down in the dumps. Where there is no election imminent. He's not crashing in the polls like Poilievre did late last year. So let's put this whole thing in context. There are some concerns about here. They talk about things like immigration and public safety, and those are ongoing issues. The whole thing that we've talked about on the podcast before is what's a big issue? Well, it's something that affects you. That what we call kitchen table issues. In other words, the stuff that's happening to you in your neighborhood. When you go to the store, how much are you paying for celery? What's happening in your neighborhood? Is crime up in your neighborhood? Was there a crack house that was just busted or not busted that you wish were busted? These things go on. And invariably, of course, we look at this and say, well, if it's happening to me or if it's happening in my neighborhood, then the government's got to step in and do something about that. And sometimes that's not the case. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, my experience in government was at the municipal level for about 10 years. And when you knock on somebody's door, they want to talk to you about everything. Not about garbage collection necessarily or snow clearing, which are municipal issues, but about, what's happening with, Ukraine or this or that. And I get that. People are frustrated and they want somebody to talk to, especially an elected official to talk to. And that happens. So I get that. But what we need to do here is focus on what the challenges are for this government and what they're going to do going forward. And the chemistry in the House of Commons once these guys get back to work next week. We know, of course, that Pierre Poilievre is going to be back as leader of the opposition. He won his by-election in the summertime. Took him about 15 seconds after he was declared the winner to revert back to the old Pierre Poilievre, the little guy who's just full of little trite and unrealistic slogans. That's his way of trying to be an opposition leader, axe the tax, stop the crime, blah, 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 blah. and on it goes. No solutions to them, of course. And they kind of doubled down on that just a couple of days ago when Poilievre sent a letter to the Prime Minister, basically with a list of demands. Here's what I want this government to do. Here's what we should do in the next session of Parliament. Please, Mr. Poilievre, you didn't win the election. You're not the Prime Minister. You don't set the agenda. Okay? That's up to the Prime Minister and his government. And we already know that you're going to vote against everything because that's the way you are. There's never going to be any sense of cooperation or reaching across the aisle, as is often the case, has been anyway, with past governments to try to make government work for the people. It's all about partisan issues with Poilievre, and we have to understand that when they get back to work on Monday, that's going to be his modus operandi. And it's going to be frustrating, and it's going to be counterproductive to trying to address some of these issues. And I think the Prime Minister knows that, but we need to realize that and remember that too when we hear about some of the other things that are going on and some of the little sound bites that Poilievre that is going to start throwing out to us. You know, when we're upset about the grocery prices or the price of gas or whatever, it's easy to blame the government, but we have to understand some of the issues behind this and some of the challenges that we're facing. Now, I've also been told that there are some MPs, conservative MPs certainly, who are going to be following Poilievre that way, but even some of the Liberal MPs are sort of concerned about some of the policies and some of the things that the Prime Minister has talked about over the last couple of months. Things like eliminating the carbon tax, of course, on gas, pausing the EV mandate for automakers. A lot of concern about that. And a lot of that is coming, as you might expect, from, you know, environmental groups or environmentally leaning MPs who are saying that's really, you know, not where we should be going. But as we've talked about on previous podcasts, what the Prime Minister is doing here, and I think it's the right thing to do here, is taking a pragmatic approach to what's going on. Yes, we know climate change is an issue. Yes, we know that we have to do something about this, and we know we're not doing enough. Nobody is these days. But there's the other element to this too, is what about the economy? When the automakers come to the Prime Minister and say, you've got to help us here, there's too much pressure on this, we're going to go out of business. As we talked about on a previous podcast, governments have been forced in the past to bail these people out, you know, when they start shutting factories down and laying people off. You don't want it to get to that point. And what the Prime Minister has said, and it's worth repeating here, he's not canceling the EV mandate. He's simply pausing it and doing a reassessment of what's going on. You know, you have to connect the dots here. When automakers are closing plants and laying off shifts at the automaker because they're not selling cars, the government's got to help to do something about that. And if it means, okay, maybe back off on that mandate, maybe it's unrealistic. And I think that's what the Prime Minister is talking about right now. I, quite frankly, thought it was unrealistic. You know, it's laudable for any government to be aspirational and say this is where we should be by 2030. I've always thought there should be more of a concentration on hybrid vehicles, for instance, to ease us into this. And I think consumers would be much more comfortable with that. But the sale of EVs went down long before the Prime Minister responded to this. Canadian people and Canadian consumers just were not gravitating to EVs, not to the extent and with the speed that they thought they were going to. And that's a reality. And the government has to deal with reality, not aspirations. So when you start talking about things like that or building pipelines, the reality is, you know, again, you want to be aspirational, well, there should be no pipelines. Well, that's unrealistic. We have product that the world wants, whether it's oil or whether it's liquid natural gas, and we need to get that to market. We need to make sure that in Europe and in Asia, the people that want it have access to it. And we haven't done a very good job of that. Carney is trying to do something about that. We just heard today that when they come up with their list of some of the major projects they want to start working on this fall, the pipeline's not going to be on that list. And not because he doesn't think it's a good idea, but because there's nobody in the private sector has come forward and say, yeah, we want to partner with you on that. And if there's nobody to build it, the government can't fund it because the government's not going to build it. And I know that Daniel Smith in Alberta is kind of ticked about that, and a lot of other people are, but that's the reality. And so, you know, and he didn't say we're not going to build one. He just said we're not ready for it yet. And that's being pragmatic and realistic about our expectations. And I know that nothing happens, you know, in a vacuum. There are always going to be some give and take. You know, the rumor that we heard just the other day is that there could be some consideration to alleviate the tariffs on Chinese EVs coming into the country. Now, we did that, of course, and of course the government of China responded very quickly with a huge tariff on canola, and Premier Mo in Saskatchewan and others are very concerned about that. As a matter of fact, earlier this week he was over in China trying to negotiate and try to find some leverage in here. Canada may just back off on the tariff to the Chinese EVs, but there's a different scenario here than there is with what they're dealing with the United States. If it's a reciprocal deal, in other words, if China says, yeah, you do that, let us do the EVs with no tariffs, we'll drop the canola tariff. Well, that's a win. And that's what I think is missing here. And I think that's one of the things that I hope they're talking about behind closed doors at the Liberal caucus. What I think the people want, and certainly what MPs want, they want a few more wins here. You know, the cause and effect. I remember the day that Prime Minister Carney was sworn in, one of the first things he did was cancel the carbon tax on fossil fuels on gasoline. And the very next day when I went to fill up, and many of us in Canada went to fill up, the price of gas was down. So that's a cause and effect, win-win. Hey, immediately I felt the effect of that. And that was a positive thing that happened. And, you know, you can take that to the bank. The government needs more wins right now. And they don't have to be major ones. Doesn't mean they're going to have to, you know, build a pipeline next week or, you know, drop the price of gasoline. But there has to be some movement to try to get us to those points. And we need to see, as Canadians, some progress here. And it's a little frustrating when it doesn't happen as fast as we want to see it happen. But those, again, are some of the political realities. And let's not kid ourselves here. A lot of the problems that we're looking at economically in this country are still tied to Donald Trump and the tariffs. Not all of them, but they're having an impact. And because we know the tariffs are a stupid way to run an economy. Goldman Sachs, the globally renowned banking system and investment and wealth management company, released a report last week that said 87% of the tariff money that's going to the U.S. government is coming from U.S. companies. It's not coming from foreign governments like Trump says it is. Canada's going to pay. The U.K. is going to pay. No, they're not. The American companies want that product, and they're paying the tariff, and it's going to the government. That's an extra tax on U.S. companies. Of course, when Trump was asked about that, he said, "Oh, it's not true," and which is what his modus operandi is. He just deny. And sadly, there are too many Americans that just take whatever this guy says as gospel, and it's going to have a negative impact on them. But as long as that mindset is going on, it's going to have an impact on the Canadian economy. And unfortunately, that's another reality. So, we've got to mind our own house, and we've got to do what the Prime Minister is talking about divesting and moving trade to other countries, not eliminating trade with the U.S., but at least not becoming as reliant as we have in the past. And that's our bad. I mean, we've let that happen, not just the Trudeau government, but other governments have let that happen. And we've got to turn that around, and it's not going to happen overnight. Nobody can just flick a switch and say, okay, everything's going to be good now. As to the disgruntled MPs, they've got to learn to be patient. I know they're the ones that, were on the front lines. They were going to the barbecues and the openings of this, that, and the other thing in their constituencies over the summer. And they probably got an earful from people saying, hey, we want this to be fixed right now. And that can happen. And there are going to be those who were Liberal MPs in the past and Liberal supporters who were loyal to Justin Trudeau. I don't think there's a whole lot of them, but there were some. And they're concerned about the fact that the Carney government seems to be abandoning a lot of the Trudeau policies. Well, I'm sorry, that's a good thing, okay? And I think most Canadians would agree that eliminating a lot of the Trudeau policies is a good thing. So don't think that that's going to drag down the Liberal caucus. I think most Canadians are saying, good, it's about time that somebody looked at this, with clear options for the future as opposed to the rose-colored glasses, the aspirational stuff that a lot of people in the Trudeau government had. So let's worry about that later on. Let's just see what this government can do. And keep in mind that we're still dealing with a huge, huge problem with Trump and the tariffs and the impact that's having on the economy. And no, it's not going as well as we thought it would. No, the negotiations, such as they are not happening. But as the great Winston Churchill once said, you can't negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. And that seems to be the problem right now. And until we can deal with that and get our head out of the mouth and start becoming a little more reliant on other countries, we're going to have to deal with Trump and just look at the fallout and say, well, that's unfortunately the way things are. And that's it for this edition of the podcast. Catch us wherever you get your podcasts, of course. And when you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit that notification bell for us as well. And don't forget, please, also to subscribe. We're getting great response to this, and we're loving the feedback that we're getting on this. But to continue to do that work, we really do need your support, and subscriptions are really going to help us. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.